So it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce my former colleague, Sam Rose. We worked together at UNRWA 15 years ago since I left the agency, but nevertheless have many strong memories and a great deal of loyalty to an agency that has done wonderful work for 75 years for the Palestinian refugees and is identified with the Palestinian cause throughout the entire region, and is facing probably its greatest threat to its existence and to its ability to deliver the essential work that it does. And I really cannot imagine anyone better than Sam, a real veteran of the agency, and someone who continues to be involved as the acting director of Gaza Field Office, even though UNRWA is not able, in practice, to be able to work much from Gaza, though I understand from Sam that there is still some residual work going on, which is to be greatly praised. With that, I'm going to turn over to Sam, and then we'll come back with a short question and answer, and then it'll be your turn also to ask some questions. Thank you. Sam?
Thanks, Andrew, and I hope you can hear me well. I'm often told that I need two microphones because I speak quietly, but I hope that's audible. And look, nice to see so many people here, so many old friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests focused on this issue, and colleagues and friends from Gaza as well, where I was until recently. As Andrew said, I've worked for UNRWA for several years, on and off, been involved with Gaza for about 20 years and have been living there since January of 2024. So throughout most of the war, I'm currently the director of UNRWA's operations in Gaza. When I got the invitation in, I don't know when it was, February I think of this year, to speak, I was hoping that I'd be speaking to you from Gaza, but unfortunately not. Unfortunately, I'm in exile, like all the UNRWA international staff working in Gaza. We were forced to leave as a result of the Knesset legislation against UNRWA that I'll come back to later. And talk about how that's impacting UNRWA's work, and also talk a bit about how all aid agencies are functioning in Gaza right now, given the situation, and where we go from here in light of the Israeli plans, the US plans, all this stuff that is evolving literally as we speak. Discussions going on in Geneva right now about this new model that's been proposed, and what that means for Palestinians, what that means for UNRWA, what it means for the rest of the UN. But of course, like other speakers have said, I really have to start with what's happening in Gaza today, which is unprecedented and tenable, but as others have said, and as we all know, remains acceptable in the eyes of the world. We're all used, those of us dealing with the Palestinian issue, used to restrictions on every aspect of Palestinian life have been a feature of the Israeli conflict, but clearly what we're seeing now is absolutely unprecedented. And what we're seeing, and what we've seen over the last 9 weeks, since the siege, the blockade was brought into effect overnight on the 2nd of March, is also completely unprecedented. Never in the history of the conflicts has Israel blocked aid for so long, or so brazenly. Never, as others have said, has the intent been stated so clearly by Israeli lawmakers. And whilst we hear and we see the daily outrage by member states, by the media, and we assume that there's lots of diplomacy going on behind the scenes, and of course there's lots of legal action, as we heard from the previous speakers, there's a complete vacuum in terms of actions and consequences for those who are imposing this blockade. And that has implications immediately for Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, let's not forget, but also wider implications for the international humanitarian system, the international political system, and for governments who ascribe to international humanitarian law and legal frameworks that they're not adhering to. And as Michael said, I think in the last session, the permissiveness with which Israel is able to act, both domestically but also internationally, not just enabling what they're doing, but emboldening this action, has seen, horrific events that would never for those of us who've been involved in this, living in Gaza or wherever, never would have been acceptable in the past. But that's what we're seeing over the past 19 months, and that's what we're seeing in particular over the past 9 weeks, when literally nothing has been allowed into Gaza. No food, no fuel, no electricity lines, etc. And this is happening to a population, who have been through so much over the past 19 months, almost the complete destruction of Gaza, health centers, hospitals, homes, universities, schools, etc., repeated displacement, repeated cycles of displacement. Many families that went home during the ceasefire are now back in their tents. Many that went home or to the rubble of their homes in Gaza during the ceasefire have remained there. But this blockade isn't just coming into effect, out of any context. It's coming into effect after 19 months of war, and war that has escaped superlatives into the, in terms of the most intense bombardment of a concentrated urban space, the most rapid descent of a population into severe food insecurity in recorded history, the highest number of journalists, and these are Palestinian journalists, because of course foreign journalists are not allowed in, the highest number of Palestinian journalists killed in any conflict worldwide, and the largest number of UN workers slain anywhere. And most of those, almost 300, are my staff. These are UNRWA staff. Every day, every week, there are new attacks, new atrocity to speak of. And if it were a different day, I'd be speaking of a different event. But over the past 2 days, we've had an attack on an UNRWA school in Barej in central Gaza, where 2,000 IDPs were staying. No meaningful notice of that attack was given. Over 30 people killed, 70 injured, large-scale damage. Some of you have seen the footage of that damage. And as we see increasingly, or I find increasingly with the footage that we're all seeing on our mobile phones, what is more haunting is the people who are still alive, rather than just the dead bodies, the shock, the fear, the helplessness on people's faces. And today, and it's not garnered much attention in the international media, Israeli police raided UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem, closing those schools and denying education to about 900 children. These are children under the age of 15. But by this time next week, there'll have been more events, and we'll almost have forgotten about those events, just because of how frequent and how normalized, sadly, they've all become. And this suffering is beyond beyond the physical suffering, beyond the mental suffering. We have an entire population in Gaza, 2.2 million people, living in a constant state of fear, a constant state of humiliation, and a constant state of helplessness. As I'm sure with many of you, colleagues and friends, call saying that they go to bed wondering if they're going to wake up in the morning, or if their friends and family are going to wake up in the morning, and they worry now about where the next meal is going to come from. And the threats that we heard in the first weeks and months of the conflict around forced displacement, around cutting off of aid, they are now official Israeli government policy. And this is for a population that is entirely dependent on external supplies. Apart from vegetables, apart from some seafood, which requires going into the waters of the Mediterranean and putting your life at risk, Gaza is wholly dependent on external supplies to stay alive. And of course, this is a conflict in which we've seen repeated and systematic targeting of the health infrastructure across Gaza. So we now have a situation where Palestinians are not just dying and suffering because of the bombardments, but because of the lack of healthcare and the inability of the health system to meet those needs. These are people who've been injured, but they're also people suffering from chronic diseases, the elder, cancer patients, the disabled, children with malnourishment, we heard before, that live, lifelong implications of that malnourishment, not getting the care that they need. So, I mean, what does all this mean for 8 organizations, including my own, operating in Gaza. Well, look, to all intents and purposes, delivery of aid has completely stopped. It stopped a few weeks ago following the imposition of the blockade in early March. We were, as a system, providing universal food distributions. 2 million people received food within the space of 10 days during the ceasefire. That has all ground to a halt. There are community kitchens, essentially soup kitchens, that still operate, but they are decreasing the number of meals that they can provide with every given day. Whereas this time last week, 1 million meals a day were being provided, which is a lot, but for a population of 2 million needing 3 million a day, 2 million people needing 3 million, 2 million people needing 3 meals a day, we can see what the deficit is. Those kitchens that were providing 1 million meals are now down to about 400,000 meals a day. So the gap is absolutely incredible in terms of that. And it will just get worse as a result of the lack of supplies, as a result of the lack of fuel. We've seen already over the past days and weeks increased incidents of looting, including of the UNRWA Gaza field office, Andrew, that you'll know very well, of WFP stores, of other stores as well, driven by desperation, driven by vacuum created by a lack of law and order on the ground. And there have been repeated reports about the food security and famine-like conditions inside Gaza. The next iteration of those reports will be issued on Monday, the IPC report, and it will be no surprise that it will, number one, report a marked deterioration in the situation. We also know as well, without a doubt, that both the US and Israel will dismiss the findings of that report. And so the UN has said that it's staying, not to stay and deliver, which is a common UN refrain, but that we're staying and advocating and staying and bearing witness to what goes on. I mean, that's not strictly true for UNRWA at least, because despite the restrictions on our activities, there's this conception that aid can be reduced to supplies. And this is precisely the Israeli model which is being discussed right now, that heads of families will go once every 2 weeks, once a month, to a certain space to collect a box of food weighing 20 kilograms. Then they'll go off and life will go on. But of course, life isn't like that. There is not just the aid distribution, there are the aid services and the public services that continue. So although I'm not in Gaza, my international UNRWA colleagues are not in Gaza. 99.9% of our staff are Palestinian staff. These are frontline workers, teachers, doctors, other health workers, social workers, garbage collectors, distribution workers, etc. They are showing up to work every single day. 12,000 people in the UNRWA workforce showing up to work every day, as do the municipalities and as do other local actors. These are the organizations that are collecting the garbage from the camps, that are at great risk to themselves, distributing the small amounts of fuel that are available to allow water pumps, to allow water wells to keep running. Those services are continuing, and we're able to continue those. Even UNRWA, despite the ban on UNRWA, because of the workforce, because of the systems that we have in place. And the scale that we are, at which we're able to work is quite remarkable. I mean, Andrew, you referred to it as residual activities. I'll give a few figures just to give a sense of the scale. I mean, right now there are 100,000 people sheltering in 115 UNRWA schools and the remains of UNRWA schools across the Gaza Strip. Our health staff are carrying out 17,000 medical consultations every day. This is primary health care, it's maternal care, it's child care, it's vaccinations, immunizations, dental care, physiotherapy, that type of thing. We have 25,000 children learning in classrooms, in schools that aren't under bombardment. This is informal learning, but it's giving children a bit of structure. It's giving them a sense of kind of normality in these awful conditions. We have children enrolled in online learning as well, believe it or not, hundreds thousands of them. But this is not happy land. This is becoming more difficult by the day, with every day, with the blockade on supplies, the ability of our health services to provide those services when there are every day fewer drugs to dispense becomes much more difficult. As fuel supplies dwindle as well, our ability to produce water wells in our schools, in the camps, also becomes much reduced. And the average Gazan today is surviving on 6 litres of water, which is 1 flush of a toilet. But the fact that the system is able to continue is not only remarkable, but it's become a symbol of resistance. This has become the meaning of life in many ways for many Palestinians. But as others have said, it shouldn't be like that. There are rules governing provision of humanitarian assistance designed to protect aid workers, humanitarian premises, doctors, nurses, medics, etc. But with almost 300 UNRWA staff killed, 1,200 medics killed, 300 of our installations impacted in some shape or form. You don't need to be a lawyer to know that these laws and these rules of war are not being followed. Parties to the conflict also have a responsibility under international humanitarian law to facilitate the distribution of aid, and quite clearly that is not happening and has not been happening since the 7th of October. And as other speakers said as well, armed actors, and here we talk of all parties to all conflicts, have a responsibility to adhere to principles of proportionality, principles of distinction, and principles of precaution. And when we have incidents in which 30 people are killed in an UNRWA school, IDPs protected populations under international law, again, it would appear that is not happening. And of course, we must and we do continually call for the dignified and immediate release of hostages, but in this case, as we know, these wrongs do not make a right. 2 wrongs, sorry, do not make a right. And look, Gaza in general is a very, very difficult place to distribute aid, to work as a humanitarian worker. It's been commonly referred to as the most dangerous place on the planet to be a humanitarian, and a very difficult place, as I say, to work in somewhere that shouldn't be. It's one of the smallest, most overcrowded places on Earth. And as humanitarians, we're used to working in places where, the road infrastructure isn't great, the geography, the land, parts of the land, there's some parts of it are inaccessible because of the terrain. That's simply not the case in Gaza. We have thousands and thousands of trucks of aid, literally kilometers away outside, whilst the population starves. But it's difficult, and it's difficult because of these controls that are imposed by Israel during this war, but that have been a feature of life, as we heard from other speakers as well, throughout the occupation since 1967. We know about a lot of these. I don't need to go into the details for an audience such as you, but it makes things difficult. Those restrictions that Israel has as a starting point have become much more difficult during a conflict, given the repeated and ongoing evacuation orders, given the fighting, the attacks on police, the breakdown in civil law and order, and as I said as well, the organized looting, which has been a real feature and will continue to be a feature whilst populations remain deprived. And look, it feels, as it does with other aspects of life, that things are done deliberately to make our lives more difficult as the humanitarian community. And within this overall framework, UNRWA, the largest actor, the organization with the greatest level of community acceptance, the best infrastructure, the assets to meet the humanitarian needs of the population, part of the social fabric in many ways of Gaza, has been particularly targeted. This targeting predates the Knesset bills which came into effect at the beginning of this year. Our staff are routinely harassed, routinely abused. Many have been detained, and as I said, many have been killed. Many have been released, and the horrific stories that they tell, and the reports and the testimonies that they give to us, to other human rights organizations that go to the courts, are simply quite harrowing. UNRWA has been banned from leading its own missions to Gaza City since April of last year as well, in flagrant contradiction of laws that require the facilitation of humanitarian aid. And we've also been subject to a vicious and ongoing information propaganda campaign as well. And this has been another feature of the conflict, in which the integrity of UNRWA, the integrity of UN organizations, the integrity of Palestinian organizations, Palestinian journalists has been repeatedly called into question in the absence of international media. UNRWA has borne the brunt, but this affects all organizations inside Gaza. Now that UNRWA internationals are not there, other agencies are now finding that they're taking the flak. And of course, we all know there's a simple solution to all of this. If Israel's discrediting the facts of what UN organizations say, and I as a UN civil servant have no interest in being anything but neutral, then all they have to do is let in international journalists. If we're being told, literally accused of lying in terms of the food that's available, in terms of the conditions on the ground, there's a pretty simple solution to all of this. So I'd add, Andrew, to your list of things that we need to push for in terms of continued, access for international journalists. I think that's very important. But look, the situation has become a lot more difficult since the Knesset bills came into effect. Those were passed with massive majorities in the Israeli court. I think about 90 votes in favor and only 10 against towards the end of last year, in October last year. They came into effect at the end of January this year. They mean two things. They ban UNRWA's activities on the sovereign territory of Israel, which for Israel includes East Jerusalem, and that's the reason why you see the eviction and the raids on our schools, our primary schools in East Jerusalem this morning. And they also prohibit contact between UNRWA and Israeli officials. So there is a no contact policy in place. They shouldn't impact on our operations in Gaza. Gaza is not the sovereign territory of Israel. The Israeli High Court recognizes that. The West Bank isn't the sovereign territory of Israel, at least in our eyes. But the reality is that these laws do impact everything that we do. And that's why I'm here, because I cannot get into Gaza without dealing with Israeli officials, without crossing the territory of Israel. The Knesset bills prohibit that. They also prohibit UNRWA from bringing its own supplies in, because the Rafah crossing, the Kerem Shalom crossing, where goods come in, is controlled by the government of Israel. And there's literally no way that we can bring those supplies in without dealing with the Israeli government. And other UN agencies who are bringing, or have been bringing, those supplies in on our behalf, at least before the blockade came into effect, have been warned off and told that there'll be punitive measures taken against them if they facilitate UNRWA's work in any way. And all this means that our staff as well, the 12,000 staff who work every day inside of Gaza, are at greater risk. If there's a critical incident, if staff are trapped in an area of conflict, we cannot call Kogat, the part of the Israeli army that we work with, we cannot call them directly to get that staff member out of difficulty. We have to work through a third party. And in a life and death incident, this literally does, a critical incident, it becomes life and death. And yet, as I said, we have thousands of trucks at the border. We in WFP, we have enough food outside in El Arish to feed Gaza for months. And every day that it's stuck there, it's incurring massive fees in storage and in demurrage, and that food is rotting, that food is expiring, and we are having to account to our donors as to why we don't have scenarios for all of this. These are the risks that the donors talk to us about. Of course, the risks that my staff talk to me about is the risk of them waking up in the morning, the risk of them being able to provide food to their families. And the intent of these laws is clear. It's to dismantle UNRWA as an organization, as the UNRWA Commissioner General has said, and it's to undermine the right of return for Palestinians and the international legal frameworks for the Palestinian issue. I mean, the logic legally is completely flawed. UNRWA has nothing, there are separate UN resolutions about the right of return and the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But of course, UNRWA is the most visible signal and symbol internationally of the continued existence of the conflict in Gaza. And of course, legally, the logic may be flawed, but we're also seeing the limits of legal action, or if not the limits, the pace at which those legal actions proceed. And quite frankly, as we all know, Palestinians in Gaza do not have that time. Israel continues to argue, and with the new Trump administration, they're joined by the Americans as well, that UNRWA services can be replaced. And yes, sure, some of this can be replaced. I mean, WFP can deliver the food. Other organizations can deliver the tarpaulins, the plastic sheets, etc. But right now, nobody in UNRWA can replace UNRWA's health. No one in Gaza can replace the UNRWA health system, the UNRWA education system, systems that have been built through billions of dollars of investment over the past decade, including by the British government. I mean, these are functions that can only really be taken over by a functioning state. There is no other organization set up, the UN organization set up that can deal with it. And it has a particular impact in Gaza, given the scale of what UNRWA does. 2/3 of the population are Palestine refugees registered with UNRWA, and in the lack of a viable alternative over the past 20 years, the pressure and the demand for UNRWA services has only increased, and UNRWA has taken on an increasingly important role. So if you take UNRWA out of the aid equation in Gaza, you have a massive, broad impact on the overall humanitarian response. And that's where we are now, because this may have started with an attack on UNRWA, with an attack on international NGOs who are no longer able to get registered unless they agree not to be critical of the state of Israel. But we're seeing now an attack on the entire aid system. And it feels, as we heard from other speakers, that partly the lack of the impunity, the lack of accountability has fueled further actions. But I do have the sense that Israel was surprised with how easily it got away with banning UNRWA. They thought there would be massive action. As you said, Andrew, I think in your opening remarks, there's rhetorical urgency has been accompanied by complete policy-making impotence and complete impunity. And this is encouraged and emboldened the state of Israel to take further and bolder steps. And now a kind of really cruel momentum has taken root. And earlier on, there were indications that Israel would be prepared to offer workarounds to allow UNRWA's operations to continue, at least for a transitional period. But with the assumption of power of the new U.S. administration, that has changed completely. And that brings us back, really, as I come to an end on where we are today. We have reports that UN agencies are being actively pressured by the US government with threats of funding to be withheld unless they comply with the new Israeli plan, which essentially amounts to internment camps in parts of Gaza, leading to a life that's so unbearable that people voluntarily migrate. But given the funding pressures that the UN system is under, some of the agencies are in a very, very difficult position. The UN position on this has been clear. The Secretary General, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, heads of all agencies have come out vocally and aggressively rejecting the model. So let's see where it goes. Sadly, we don't have time on our side. So I'll just end with two quick points. One, and it's what others have said as well in their speeches, is this chilling climate of impunity and lack of accountability. We all know there should be consequences. On today of all days, VE Day, and the frameworks that are put in place after the Second World War exist, obligations exist on the parties to the conflict, and also, as others have said, on member states to the United Nations, linked to the UN Charter and linked to their membership and continued membership within the United Nations. Those, despite all the evidence of what's happening, are not being adhered to. This, of course, has immediate implications for the population of Gaza, but also structural implications for humanitarian action around the world. If there is no accountability, if there's continued impunity, then it sends messages to other countries that there'll be no consequences if they fail to adhere to IHL, or principles that are really at the heart of the UN Charter. And we're increasingly, I think, close to that point where member states have to be asked whether or not they still adhere to these frameworks that we've got. And if not, we throw them out and we start again. But the dissonance right now is becoming increasingly deafening. I mean, and if there is continued impunity, it will send messages to communities who rely on humanitarian assistance and rely on trust between us and the populations we assist, that we're not reliable partners, but we can be bought off, we can be paid off for political ends. And this will contribute to further global erosion of trust in the international humanitarian system, which has massive implications everywhere, far beyond Gaza, every single place where we work. And then secondly, just briefly on the humanitarian paradigm for Gaza, for decades, Western governments, including all Western governments, unable to provide a just and lasting solution to the Palestine-Israel issue, have treated Palestine, including through UNRWA, as a humanitarian aid program and not a political issue of self-determination. And the limits of this approach are being completely laid bare. We know what needs to happen: immediate ceasefire, dignified immediate release of hostages, flow of aid, but we also know what needs to happen beyond that. And that's why I think events such as this are so important, to pressure member states to do the right thing, to say that enough is enough in terms of this, and that the lives of Palestinians, the futures of Palestinians and Israelis need to be safeguarded by refusing to accept this status quo and enforcing a real settlement where both sides can live in peace, in justice, and the Palestinians can have the freedom and liberties that Israelis also enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very deeply from all of us to you and your brave colleagues at UNRWA, particularly the local staff who have confronted such dangers and threats to their lives and continued to fulfill their duties. We're running out of time, but I don't want to take a break right here. I just want to broaden the discussion just for a couple of minutes to look at the larger role of the United Nations. I mean, let's remind ourselves, this is occupied territory. This is territory where the populations are meant to be protected by the international community, by the treaties and conventions that have been signed that govern occupied territories. And this comes back to the role of the United Nations, which is a special role for this territory. After all, Israel was admitted into the United Nations on the condition that it addressed the Palestinian refugee question. We can see that that has been respected in the abeyance of such conditions and has failed to be able to live up to the promises. Surely, if we are trying to be practical and positive about what needs to be done, which is one of the purposes of events like this, we need to insist that there be presence of international monitors who can be there to report to the international community, particularly the Security Council, where, as you know perfectly well, the Security Council has been somewhat marginalized from this issue, largely because of the US veto, but for other reasons also, in order to be able to say that an agency like UNRWA, as you know well, has got a protection role as well, by being witness and reporting on what's taking place. And your forced exclusion from the territories means that that role cannot be fulfilled. Can you see other agencies doing that? Can you see other bodies being able to do that? Or should we be coming up with something new and insisting that Israel respects that protection of civilians in occupied territories is something that they're obliged to do?
I mean, it's a deep question. I think anything can I mean, there can be a number of bodies that could perform this function. We have the capabilities, we have the structures, we have the models, we have the approaches. The issue, as with all of this, is getting the agreement amongst the parties to accept this kind of model and to accept this as part of a broader political process that seems further away than ever today. I mean, there have been countless talks over the course of this conflict about what we know full well, and we've known from the start that we're not going back to the 6th of October. The model that we've had in place will no longer obtain, but we are unable to reach, or the system, the international community, is unable to reach agreement on what that model should look like, and it's because of the polarization within the Security Council, but also given the relative, I think the relative power of the parties to the conflict, which means that one party of the conflict has complete veto over, or apparently complete veto over anything that Hamas, and as we're all saying, can continue to act against that. So it'd have to be not forced on them, but pressured for them to take that path.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, you're probably dying for a break, but I really think that you're probably dying also to ask questions. So let's take a couple of minutes to be able to see if there are any hands that are really urgent. Right at the back, please.
Oh, you have a mic.
There's a microphone coming your way.
A couple of them, yeah. Really keen to...
Okay.
Thank you very much.
We'll come your way.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
No.
Like so. Very good. Thank you very much indeed for that very illuminating talk and filling us in on so much detail. I want to raise something I'd also have liked to raise with the earlier speakers, but I think it's also relevant to UNRWA. What is the role of the Geneva Convention here? And I'm thinking of the duty of signatory states to the Geneva Convention to enforce it. Because it seems to me that this is something we've not touched on this afternoon, and it strikes me as something we should really be urging the British government to do.
Let me take a couple of other questions, because in the interest of time, I think we ought to give two or three together. So I recognize the lady over here.
Thank you to everyone. I'm Hadani Ditmars. I'm a journalist. I've been working in Iraq and Palestine for 30 years, and I'm a doctoral candidate at King's College London here. I'm on my way to Baghdad. I'm writing a new book on Iraq, and for the Arab League Summit, ironically. So I had a question about, have we seen this movie before? I went to so many Iraqi hospitals, 500,000 children died under sanctions. What can we learn or compare in terms of the situation for Palestinians and for Iraqis? And also, how can we stop the criminalization and the murder of humanitarian workers and journalists in Gaza and Palestine in general? As Sam so aptly put, this is a terrible, horrific, genocidal situation for the Palestinians, but also it's precedent-setting for Western democracies. These acts of murder continue with impunity. And also, why is Duarte in The Hague and not Netanyahu? Thanks.
So there's a connection there, Sam, between the Geneva Conventions and the protection of humanitarian workers also. Any comments?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so in relation to the Geneva Convention, there may be other people who are better qualified to speak in terms of its applicability to Gaza, but yeah, I mean, there.
Wait for a microphone. Victoria, do you want to speak on this matter? And there's a mic coming your way.
Oh, I mean, I was in the Foreign Office about 4 or 5 months ago.
Could you speak
this
louder?
question to the Deputy Legal Advisor and the UK's position, which is in the minorities, that don't have any responsibility to uphold or enforce international humanitarian law. obligation
Sorry,
to promote
we missed that.
IHL.
The
That
UK
was the
doesn't have an
position.
obligation?
No, there's no binding legal obligation on the UK to promote IHL. That's what they said. And there was a big argument between the interlocutors, and they weren't backing down on that.
I can see I've opened up a hornet's nest here.
I have a question. Can I ask a question? Further question. It's a question about UNRWA, and hopefully you can answer this one. You interestingly made the distinction between UNRWA role and the right of return, and the fact that the right of return is enshrined by law, and therefore, whether they shut down UNRWA or not, that right remains. But my understanding was that UNRWA was holding very important records of the refugees. Is that correct?
It is correct.
So from that perspective, then there is a direct dependency from shutting down UNRWA or destroying the records and the right of return.
No, because the records exist beyond UNRWA. The argument about the right of return is that there's a different refugee protection framework for UNRWA than for Palestine refugees, than other refugees who fall under the mandate of UNHCR. So the thinking is if you dismantle and make UNRWA disappear, then Palestinian refugees will fall under the mandate of UNHCR, who work on various durable solutions. So therefore, the problem just disappears. There's also a fraudulent argument that under UNHCR, refugee status does not pass from one generation to another, but it does. And this is an argument that is continually recycled, that UNRWA is criticized for perpetuating the refugee issue because we're an active symbol of the Palestinian situation and the Palestinian question. We didn't answer the question on.
Do you want to take it?
I mean, there are. It's part of international humanitarian law that governs protection of humanitarian workers. It's scandalous that so many are continuing to die, continuing to suffer on a daily basis. We advocate about this. We feed into appropriate legal processes of rapporteurs and special committees and things like that. But like with all of this, it rests with the member states to force action and pressure for action if nothing is happening and the impunity is continuing.
I think I have to take this lady who's been holding a hand up patiently, and then the gentleman in the middle, and then we'll stop there. All right, I apologize to those people on this side. I can see there's quite a demand. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all the speakers. It was really very rich and wonderful discussion. Talking.
Please speak up.
I would like to go back to the first meeting this morning. What's burning in me is that there is definitely a moral responsibility on the British government, which is my government, okay? And I'm extremely loyal in many areas, but I was shocked and disappointed, like everybody here in the diaspora, by the double standard. The only thing cooled me down, and I hope that it will be a start of soul-searching and conscience awakening, was when I watched Alistair Burt, the foreign minister from the previous government, when he admitted that the biggest mistake we have committed at British government is that ignoring Israeli expansion policy through the settlement until we reach to the day we are in today. And of course, the impunity and all of this. Now, my main concern on two sides. One side that if Israel fulfill its dream and kick my family out, would the British government accept them as refugees, in this country? And the other side of it is that considering all of this moral responsibility, which I'm shocked with it because I know better about the British values and I love a lot of them adopted. Whatever it is, within these British values, won't you think that Britain could be in a position to lead for a Marshall Plan to reconstruct Gaza? This is what I would expect from my government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. I don't hear much in this present situation about the UN legislation responsibility to protect. Do you think there is more that could be used to bring a difference to this situation?
And we'll take the question over there also before we reply.
Thank you. I think there is a tension that I've noticed in the day whereby you're emphasizing the legal obligations on MPs to act in a certain way and on countries. Also, the democratic imperative to act because the majority of the populations are demanding it. So individual MPs are faced against the law and their electorate. At the same time, they're not abiding by these very strong powers acting on them, and they're exercising discretion. Where do they have the power in law to exercise this discretion against what's legal and against what is in popular demand? I understand that that has to do with being tied to NATO and US policy. That itself is fracturing at the moment. Is there an opportunity, but also is there some legal route to challenge this discretion that is overriding everything else?
It's an excellent question, but I think it would be better to defer the answer to that to the next panel of lawyers. I think really if we could just hold on to that. Do you have anything to say on R2P?
Right to protect. I mean, there is a right to protect. There's a responsibility to protect, rather. But we've seen repeated failures of this construct for the past 20 years, sadly, through Iraq, Afghanistan, into Syria, Ukraine, and now in Gaza. So, I mean, the UN will continue to do what it does. We've sought recourse to various legal instruments and the highest courts within the UN system, and yet this continues. And it is not just, it's not just the advisory opinions linked to the Gaza war, linked to the activities of the United Nations going all the way back to the wall, and the barrier ruling that was issued, in 2004. So the fracturing of this, I got further evidence of the decreased moral weight of these constructs that we have, sadly.
Yeah.